Our speaker this hour is Brother Wayne Blake, and he's going to be speaking on the subject, the writing on the wall, Daniel the 5th chapter. That's another one of those children's stories that has a great deal of application for us as well. But he and his wife Laura have one child, and they're with us this week. We appreciate them coming as well. And introducing Bruce, I mentioned that Brother Blake was a member there at where Bruce preaches. It's the Fish Hatchery Road congregation in Huntsville, Texas. He is a graduate of Spring Bible Institute in '98 and has worked with congregations in Texas, Tennessee, Louisiana. He also continues to speak on various lectureships and holds gospel meetings. We appreciate him, the work that he does, the stand that he takes, his love for the truth. And we're looking forward to hearing him on this subject, the writing on the wall from Daniel the 5th chapter.
Thank you, Brother Michael. I am honored again to be able to stand before you and to speak on another timely subject. Brother Michael stated this subject is one that I remember probably back as far as I can remember, and some of you who are older than I know that sometimes your memory doesn't work all that well, but there are certain things that were pounded in your mind, impacted you, and these are one of the stories right here, one of the accounts given to us here in Daniel chapter 5. I'm very happy this morning because my lesson hasn't been touched. So I'm plowing new ground here. So I'm very thankful for that, but whether it was or not, it doesn't really matter to me. In Daniel chapter 5, we will, because of time restraints and all, we're not going to read all of this chapter, but we will allude to it and allude to certain verses and try to get an overall picture of this account here in chapter 5. And then, as time permits, we will try to make application in regards to this. The time of Nebuchadnezzar had passed. Now we find in the book of Daniel, a new ruler. It is Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, Belshazzar. And we see that Belshazzar, lifted with his great pride, just like his father, begins to offend God. And as a result of this, God then pronounces punishment upon Belshazzar and my wife. Something wrong with my tie. She's over here going. Now it's worse. Why don't I just take it off? Okay. Well, you'll have to forgive me. My wife didn't dress me this morning. I did. Yes, I am embarrassed. Belshazzar, lifted with pride just like his father, then begins to offend God. And as a result of this offensive attitude and behavior, God then pronounces his judgment against him as well as the kingdom. And Daniel 5 begins to show us a reminder that if we want to offend God, God will have the last say. And I look out among our brethren, I look among the world at large, and we have a lot of people who are offending God. And their day is coming. So this morning we want to look at this. And for chapter 5, we begin in verse 1. A great feast is pronounced. Belshazzar begins by having a party. Now this is not your common East Texas party where you have lemonade and iced tea and barbecue. No, this is a party that was offensive to God and offensive to the Christian. More than likely, this party was it was more like a drunken orgy party that you read about, a lot of very sad things going on. And history tells us, as well as the context, I believe, tells us that obviously this party was also offered, in a sense, to the gods that Belshazzar and others had followed. There are many parties that are presented to us through Scripture that are shown as a negative party. And that is, first of all, a party that was held by Ahasuerus in Esther chapter 1. As well as the party that Herod had at his birthday. And we all know what happened to John after that party. Such parties and festivities have only one end in mind. And that is the satisfaction of the lust of the flesh. And this is the kind of party he was having. This type of partying, very clearly through the Scripture, teaches us that it is condemned. We talk about parties in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 21, where it talks about drunkenness, revelings, and such like. That's the kind of party that we're having here. And Paul writes and says, such to partake in these things shall not inherit the kingdom of God. They're an abomination to God. We are not to take part in those types of things. And Peter himself, in 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 3, talks about the will of the Gentiles when we walked in lasciviousness, lust, excess of wine, revelings, banquetings, and abominable idolatries. No good ever comes from participating in these types of revelries. Then in verse 2 and verse 3, we are introduced to Belshazzar, now commanding that the gold and the silver vessels be brought. And now they become a part of the party. Now, these vessels are the ones that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem. And his purpose was for his court to use these vessels in their feastings. The king, the princes, his wives, and his concubines. Those holy vessels that Belshazzar had brought were God's vessels. They had been dedicated to God, and they were to be used for holy purposes. In Numbers chapter 4 and verse 15 it says that those who used these vessels were punishable by a sentence of death. And here was Belshazzar, laughing it up, having a good old time in the sense of the world and how they view things, using something God has sanctified as holy. I'm reminded of Nadab and Abihu. They brought strange fire, in other words, unauthorized fire before God. And God devoured them with fire. In Leviticus 10, verse 1. You also think about Uzzah, who just a very simple thing, trying to steady the Ark of the Covenant, he also was struck dead. In 2 Samuel 6, verse 6 and 7. Holy things are to be used for holy purposes. And they're not to be used for everyday common use. We must respect God's will regarding holy things today. Our worship. You could start at A and go to Z and mention the many things that people are incorporating as, quote, worship to God. And yet God has very clearly told us what is acceptable in worship. And yet they offered it. And they continue. More about that later. In teaching God's plan for salvation, how many people are changing the simple question, what must I do to be saved? And depending on who you ask, will depend upon what kind of answer you're going to get. People are changing what you need to do to be saved. In regard to the organization of the church, it's already been mentioned this week, and it's very clear, we all understand, women serving in offices that were and have always been, by God, required for men. Well, women serving as elders, as pastors, as preachers, and all manner of things. Holy things must be respected. Then verse 4, the foolishness of false idols. They praised the gods of gold, silver and brass, iron, wood, and stone. They robbed God of His glory, and they gave their glory that was due God's to fleshly things. Idolatry is condemned very clearly in the Scriptures. Exodus chapter 20, verse 3 through 5, the statement begins by saying, "Thou shalt have no other gods before thee." Isaiah 42 and verse 8, "I am the Lord. This is my name. And my glory will I get, and my glory will I, God, give to another. Not give to another. Neither my praise to graven images." Idolatry, we think about little idols and things like that. But you know, as has been already mentioned this week, idolatry comes in many forms. And basically an idol is anything that we put before God. Boy, we have a world and a brotherhood full of people who have a lot of gods, but not God, capital, God the Father, in the right place. Then verse 5 to verse 23, he failed to remember history. The handwriting on the wall begins in verse 5 through verse 9. In the middle of this great party and all the things that are going on there, this hand appears. And it writes on one of the walls. This troubles the king. Obviously it should. And so he's so puzzled to where he begins to wonder, well, what is this? What is happening here? So he calls all his wise men and wants them to read the wall and make an interpretation. None could do so. And as you know now, Daniel comes forth. In verse 10 through 12, the queen remembers Daniel and told the king not to be troubled. There is someone here who can give an interpretation. Remember Daniel. He has the Spirit of God in him. And he reminds him what Daniel did for Nebuchadnezzar on several occasions. And so she told him that Daniel would show him the interpretation. So beginning in verse 13 through 23, Daniel now stands before the king. And the king inquires of Daniel. He promises Daniel, if you'll do this, I'll make you rich and powerful. Well, Daniel, being the humble servant that he is, says, I don't want those things, but I'll interpret it for you. So, Daniel reminds Belshazzar of the pride of his father. Daniel then chastises him for not learning from the mistakes of his father. And Daniel then again chastises him for not glorifying the God of heaven. You see, Belshazzar forgot the lessons from his own family's past. 2 Peter 3 and verse 5 speaks of how that there will be those that will scoff and walk after their own lust. Romans chapter 1 and verse 28, speaking primarily about the Gentiles, it says, and even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not appropriate. And then Hosea 4 and verse 6, My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. And, we like to stop there. Many times we're quoting that, and it's not that anything wrong with that. But look at the last part of that verse. Why do they have the lack of knowledge? Seeing thou hast forgotten the law of thy God. They forgot. They put it out of their mind. God says, I will also forget my children. So Belshazzar forgets and failed to remember God's work in the life of Nebuchadnezzar. And then in verse 24 through 29, Daniel, through the help of God, directly through God, gives him the interpretation. What's the meaning? All right, in my East Texas / Hebrew interpretation, I'm going to read these 4 words. Now remember where they're coming from, because I doubt this is the way you say them in Hebrew. In fact, I'll just pretty well bet they won't. Many, Tekel, upharson. I was up till 11 o'clock getting those 4 words down. And 2 of them are the same, and I kept getting the first 2 wrong. Get the first right, mess up the second. Get the first one wrong, then let's get the right one, second one right. The word mene, God has numbered the kingdom and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balance and found lacking. And then this last word is the idea that the kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. This was a condemnation of the Babylonian Empire. Well, Belshazzar still does what he told him to do. And it makes you wonder if he really ever even believed what Daniel said. He was just happy it got interpreted, and let's move on. He gave him all that he had promised. And to me, it's somewhat meaningless for him to give him all these things, because his kingdom was due that day. But he still gave him all that he said. And those today who are faithful to the Lord deliver his messages regardless of the circumstances. And we've talked quite extensively about that, just starting Saturday night into yesterday. I am honored to stand before the men and women, because sometimes we do forget the women, the wives of these elders and preachers, and the wives and sometimes even their own children that stand behind the preachers and elders and the members of the church who stand forthrightly for the Word of God. And I'm honored to be able to stand before you and try to put forth the words that I am speaking, because no doubt we need to be a people that preach and teach the Word regardless of the circumstances. And no doubt this is not a popular message. The meaning of the writing was simply that Belshazzar was going to be destroyed. And evidently he didn't take this very seriously, or he didn't consider how urgent the message was, because he went right on partying. Right on. God's messages are always serious, and they are always urgent. How many of us have heard of young people's lives being taken from them before they ever hit 18? And all those few years they had, they were of the age of accountability, and we were trying to teach them the right thing to do. And they squandered their life away. Because in their mind, and we all went through it, I'm not even 18 yet. Boy, I've got another 40, 50, 60 years left. You don't know that. There is urgency in the gospel to make things right now. Not tomorrow, not next week, not next month, not in the years to come, but today. Then in verse 30 and 31, the ending of this chapter, Belshazzar is killed. As the writing foretold, Belshazzar and his kingdom came to a swift end. And history tells us that what happened is the Medes and the Persians diverted the Euphrates River. They kept them from being able to get to the city. They diverted this river and they drained it while they were having these parties. And so when they invaded the city by the riverbed, they found that those that were supposed to be at watch were being part of the party. They weren't even there watching. You see the pride and arrogancy? It was mentioned yesterday, it's just like 9/11. Our nation is a proud nation. Who would dare come here and cause harm to our people? Well, somebody answered that. And they answered it well. They told us, you're not too big for us to take you down a notch. And they did it. Belshazzar was slain by 2 of Cyrus' generals. And history records that Cyrus put to death every person who was found outside of their home. Well, those who were faithful Hebrews would not have participated in the revelry, and therefore their lives were saved. That's what history teaches. And this, therefore, was the end of Belshazzar and the kingdom of Babylon. This was prophesied by the prophets of Israel. Isaiah 13 and verse 19, and Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldees, excellency, shall be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. Jeremiah chapter 25 and verse 12. And it shall come to pass, when 70 years are accomplished, that I will punish the king of Babylon, and that nation, saith the Lord, for their iniquity, and the land of the Chaldeans, and will make it perpetual desolations. A promise from God. And therefore, God's will was done. Oh, we made that pretty fast, 20 minutes. Let's look at some applications of this. These are not all the applications, and we're not going to be able to get to all of this, but these are some of the ones that I decided that I wanted to go for. The life that the Christian lives today is to be modeled after the life of Christ. While upon this earth, 1 John chapter 2 and verse 3 and following, the life of Belshazzar is an example of this very day, that is an example to us this very day, that provides a Christian with a warning. We serve a jealous God, and He will not support us if we choose to do those things that do not benefit the service and the example we are before the world. God's will be done. With us or without us, His will be done. So let's look at some things. First of all, alcohol. I'm not going to go into a long, drawn-out deal with this because that was already talked about yesterday. A lot of my application was already dealt with already. And Brother Michael stepped on what was left this morning. So some of this is going to be a replay. But alcohol can cause one to make wrong decisions. All you have to do is watch television or talk to somebody in law enforcement, or many of us, you may have come upon someone who has been drinking. And you learn very quickly, with honesty of heart, brethren, we understand that alcohol causes people to make wrong decisions. How can a man get into a car more than once, over and over and over, and be arrested for DWI and not understand that what they're doing is causing the jeopardy of lives around them, and that it's a direct result of alcohol? Who could not understand that basic principle? There are deacons and elders and other members of the church today who try to rationalize drinking. I once had someone tell me, and this is a true story. Someone told me one time, the reason I go to bars is because I want to set the proper example. Now, they were being serious. I want to set the proper example. You know, you got all them people around there and they're drinking and carrying on and everything. I want to set the proper example. And it may open the door for me to be able to talk to somebody about God. That's rationalization going to seed. One thing you learn in trying to deal with people that are under the influence, boy, they're not people to be dealt with very easily. And in fact, most of them want to talk to you about something, and a lot of it has to do with how bad their lives are. Well, I've had that happen to me. People coming to me with those types of things. The Christian is to be separate and apart from the world. Our influence is to be one of purity and one of Christ-likeness in all avenues of our lives. Who would dare say the drinking of alcohol is a way to set a good example? Is that setting a good example? Well, some would say, well, yeah, because I'm teaching people one drink is all you need. And then we set a right example. What about those people that can't stop at one drink? And there are people like that among us. Not only that, initially, what is the point of drinking? We're in the summer months. It started back with Mardi Gras. And we're continuing on. Why are people drinking now? Well, they're thirsty. Well, I'm going to tell you something. Drinking alcohol doesn't help your thirst. In fact, it dries you out. That's what those headaches are about. Hangovers. Your body taking too much of those things. The world is caught up in social drinking, going to bars and parties and Mardi Gras. They only need to watch the news or hear talk about the effect that it has among those who participate in such. Idolatry. We see the word idolatry, and as I said before, we conjure in our mind many times the idea of just some kind of idol that we sit down and we'll bow before, that type of thing. Well, what about Super Bowl Sunday? Folks, that's an idol to a lot of people. I work with a guy that is a deacon in the Baptist church. And I've had a lot of biblical discussions with him to the point where I don't talk to him about the Bible anymore because he's just too ignorant. But if I talk to him about sports, he can talk my ear off. And he can tell me things about sports that I could care less about. I'm just telling you now. I like sports to a point. But I am not a sports fan where I know every team member and I just don't know all that. I've got better things to do with my time. That's the way our world is. Recreation. Things that in and of themselves there's nothing wrong with, but they are when that becomes our focus. And I've talked to him many a time about things of, well, first of all, how he could be a deacon. He has no children. And if you were to hear this man speak, he uses every vulgar word there is to be said. And yet when he gets on the phone talking to some of his members that call him at work, it's so interesting. He turns it off. And he's Mr. Nice Guy. He's a hypocrite. But you know, worldly people don't have a corner on the market of being hypocrites. Some of my brethren are the same way. Idolatry. Our own brethren are bowing before this and many other things. There are liberal congregations across the world that will postpone or cancel services on the evening of the big game. Some congregations will hold Super Bowl parties in the building with worship either before or during intermission or afterwards, just because they want to make sure that everybody shows up. Because I've heard the rationalization. Some will say, well, people aren't going to be here anyway, so let's throw the game in the middle, and that way we'll have everybody here. The excuse, because it's not a reason, is that many are not going to attend that night anyway, so we might as well try to bring some way to make it easier for them to come and fellowship with one another. I read about love feasts in 1 Corinthians 11 verse 17, and I think that falls into that category of the admonition that Paul was dealing with in love feasts. They are using these feasts to do things that are an abomination to God. Jesus warned his disciples, you cannot serve God and mammon. Matthew 6 and verse 24. Some today say, well, I don't have any idols that I bow down to. Oh, really? Well, let's think about that. How many of us know of our once faithful elders or deacons, gospel preachers, who now worship at the idol of family? And I do believe it, a family can become an idol. Family, you say? Oh, yeah, sure. Many of our brethren once stood firm on the issues of adultery, fornication, fellowship, mixed swimming, cheerleading. Well, I know some brothers, their daughters are so happy their daughters are cheerleaders. They're so happy. And I'm so sad. But now their children's lives and choices have led them away from plain biblical teaching regarding all of those subjects and more, because they chose their family over God. In Luke chapter 12, verse 49, beginning of verse 49, Jesus said, I am come to send fire on the earth. And what will I, if I be ready, already kindled? But I have a baptism to be baptized with, and how am I straitened till it be accomplished? Suppose ye that I am come to give peace on earth? I tell you nay, but rather division. For from henceforth there shall be fire in one house, there shall be 5 in one house divided, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3. The father shall be divided against the son, and the son against the father, and the mother against the daughter, and the daughter against the mother, and the mother-in-law against the daughter-in-law, and the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. But Jesus, that's our family. That's our family. Some who say they're faithful to God do not understand that sometimes their family chooses to do the wrong thing. And just like any member of the Lord's church, brethren, they also are our brethren if they're Christians. And we must do what God commands to be done regarding those who will not give up error. Boy, I just started. That clock's moving a lot slower than his clock. Pride. There are hundreds of examples of passages of Scripture dealing with the problem of pride. Belshazzar had thrown a banquet. He commended himself as being important. He invited his friends and all those to come and be a part of the celebration. He showed neither respect for God nor the things of God in regard to the temple. He was wanting to show his friends that he was something of some great man. Yet, in the eyes of God, he was found wanting. Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before the fall. Proverbs 16 and verse 18. A man's pride shall bring him low, but honor shall uphold the humble in spirit. Proverbs 29 and verse 23. How many times do we see these general truths shown to be absolute truth? There are preachers and elders and deacons and other members of the Lord's church who over time, because of reliance that the brethren place upon them, and that reliance is not wrong in and of itself, but it is in how you deal with that. You know, there are people that if I have something specific that's going on and I need someone else to talk to, I'll call them. And that's a good thing. We need to bounce ideas off each other. Deal with problems. But over time, They are asked over and over to give answers, give to questions they have, give it explanations, help with guidance. And people begin to heap praise and adoration upon them. And as the old saying goes, and after a while they begin to believe their own press. And it goes to their head. And no man, no matter how much knowledge he may have, is going to be without sin from time to time. And sometimes they may not have all the facts, and they'll give some type of explanation, and it's wrong. It's not the correct information that they have given you. And they're called on it, and it's like, who are you to question me? Who are you to question me? See, that's the sin of pride. You need to be very careful of that. Oh, we gotta keep moving. Things that God used as common cannot be used. Things of God cannot be used as common. I think about a lot of different things in this world that people take and that God has set aside and used them as common. And one thing in particular is fellowship. Folks, fellowship is a privilege. And it is a blessing granted to us by God. And for men and women to open that fellowship up to people that God has not authorized it to be granted to, that's taking something that God has sanctified and making it common. And that's what our brethren in this last few years have begun to do. But it's nothing new. And we need to understand that it is a blessing and that it is a privilege. And we better not take part in those types of things that God sets aside as good, honest, and holy, and begin to use them as common, everyday things. The home, what can you say about the home? So many problems in our homes today. God sanctified the home. God established the home. And there are people that are tweaking it and changing it and perverting it and doing all manner of things against it, taking something that is good and holy and pure and changing it to common. God will not be pleased with that when we get away from His design, His intent for the home. Well, we'll stop there. The battles we face today are not new. They're not new. Some things may be new to us, but they're not new. Go back and look at the Old Testament. Go back and read history. Brethren, some of the things we're facing right now are things that are not new. They may be new to us. It may be new to our generation, but they're not new. And if I could keep that in mind, it will help me to not lose faith. To realize that the brethren got through it then. Guess what? We can get through it now. If I just rely on God and let His will be done. Daniel was written hundreds of years ago. Yet this lesson from the book is so needed today. We must be willing to do things God's way, or we will be told on the day of judgment, "Depart from me, ye who work iniquity." Matthew 7, verse 23. The stunning part of this verse is that Jesus said no matter how much good you may do, it says that He never knew them. There are going to be a lot of people on the day of judgment that are going to hear those words. And it's our job to teach brethren to do the will of God and not our own. Thank you for your attention.
That is so true.